So I'm going to invite up to the stage Ivor Cummins, who is a chemical engineer. I told you to go on his webpage and have a look at things. Ivor's here for a very good reason. He's not been spoon-fed in the cult of medicine or cardiology. He's been on a personal journey and has spent 5 years deep diving into the literature and the evidence, and he knows more about the flaws on our current guidance than many people. So I'd ask you to forget what you think you know, spit out your cornflakes and have a listen to Ivor Cummins. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks a lot, Scott. And I'd like to thank Scott and Aynsley and Joe and Sally for allowing me to come here and unleash my thoughts on you. It'll be something completely different. So I don't want to put you off there, but I am going to be somewhat critical of LDL as a causal or as a risk factor during this, so be forewarned. It's an alternative viewpoint after many years. I'm a complex problem-solving specialist in the engineering and corporate world. I've done that for nearly 30 years. And it proved useful when I had a medical issue of my own. I got back in my tools, so to speak. So I'm just going to give a quick disclosure here. I'm supported by David Bobbitt, an Irish entrepreneur who set up Irish Heart Disease Awareness. And he has a lot of interest and a personal passion to get accurate diagnostics out there to identify the people who may die before they realize they have heart disease. But we have no financial ties to the imaging industry or any, this is all philanthropy. So I'll do 3 sections, and actually in the interest of time I'll just go ahead. So part 1 is a little story about myself, but there's a little bit of science in there also. So here was Ivor the engineer, and hopefully you recognize Ivor the engine there. And I was very happy because I was going in to get the results of standard blood tests, and I expected them to be pretty good. You know, I was in my mid-40s. And these were a few that turned out to be notable. Serum GGT, a liver enzyme, which is enormously important. Serum ferritin, the iron loading in the blood, and of course, cholesterol. But when I got the results, this is what they looked like. And because of my background, not specifically in medical issues, though I have a biochem degree, I knew looking at the lab reference ranges that these were serious. I just knew that instinctively. I also knew that there was highly likely going to be a couple of primary root causes, because no matter how complex the system, if you have something way out of whack, there's a few primaries. That's just the way it works. So I actually questioned the doctor quite aggressively, more so than many, and I ended up going to another doctor a week later, and then another one, a very experienced person, because I wasn't getting answers to the 2 key questions in any problem. What are the implications of these readings, and what are the causes that would have them thus? So I did reduce the wine intake for the GGT because there's links with alcohol, reduce the fat, increase the complex carbohydrates for the cholesterol, and hemochromatosis for the ferritin, because iron loading disease of hemochromatosis often presents with high ferritin. Interestingly, the third doctor said, I've been seeing ferritin rise for the last 20 years, especially in middle-aged men, and I've always wondered what that was. And a few weeks of research, I was able to go back and explain it all to him, which we both enjoyed. So anyway, I found that I have 5 children. I'm interested in longevity, so I decided I better research this myself. And ResearchGate PubMed have hundreds of thousands of papers, so all the data which I eat and drink is out there. So I went and began to research. Cholesterol, very quickly I'll speed through, because I quickly found papers that show, like the Hunt study with 60,000 people over 20 years, men and women, middle-aged, that higher cholesterol is associated with lower all-cause mortality. And there's men there in blue and women in red. So I won't go into all the details, but cholesterol is a very ambiguous marker. I learned deeply about it later. But I went to GGT because that one was really high. And just a little reminder, anything over a 2x odds ratio or a risk multiplier in an associational study likely means business and speaks to cause. Over a 2x. Well, it didn't take me long to find that the highest quartile of GGT was a 7x risk for coronary artery disease. It was pretty impressive. I've given an idea of what LDL might be there in the dotted lines, approximately. I found out that type 2 diabetes, biggest disease in the world, I've since realized. For my BMI, there was a 12x risk in this study, and that was just for being in the top quartile. I was way up at the very top of the top quartile. I moved on to ferritin, and I'm only showing a couple of studies here. There are many, many more. So ferritin, I'm pretty annoyed now, and I look at ferritin. Oops, ferritin a 5x risk to be in the top quintile for incident atherosclerosis in this study. And you can see the dotted line for ferritin and the solid. The dotted line is fully adjusted. Makes no difference. Ferritin's an independent marker and a powerful one for atherosclerosis. And this one should be quite interesting. Low LDL people in this study for heart attack rate and high LDL above 5 millimole. That's very high LDL. That's a tiny percentage of the population. But you'll notice there's no difference in risk for heart attacks till you look at their ferritin. Now you see a very high risk for high LDL people with high ferritin, and even an elevated one for lower LDL. And the reason mechanistically is ferritin reflects inflammatory underlying problems that are the primary driver of atherosclerosis. So it makes sense. So I was in Singapore here, very annoyed, a bit disappointed in my dogs, and I had crabs back then as well. A chili crab, pepper crab in jumbo seafood in Singapore, delicious. It's great, great eating. But I went on and I did a few more weeks of very deep research, going right down into the molecular level. But I discovered on my way insulin resistance syndrome, and some people still call it metabolic syndrome, but insulin resistance syndrome is what it is. And I hypothesized that GGT and ferritin must be serious markers for that syndrome, right? And it's huge in the chronic disease world. They must be, even though I hadn't seen that yet. But I went on targeted research. And of course they were. Ferritin is an excellent marker for degree of metabolic syndrome, and I won't even read out in GGT there. There is a mountain of science on this, but very few people are aware of it. So I applied the solution because at this stage I was getting to know all the mechanisms, and hence I was able to see what would fix my problem. And it was nutritional only. I didn't change my wine intake because that would confound the experiment. So I kept my couple of glasses a day constant. I wanted to look just at nutritional. So what I did essentially was, this is the food pyramid we've been told for 40 years, and all of my research in science and engineering problem solving said that that was required. And that's what I did. Not just a simple inversion, I tailored it. I cut out all the high sugar fruits as well. I was eating healthy fats, fish, avocado, and ancestral fatty meats as well. A high healthy fat diet, very low carbohydrate except for vegetables, non-starchy fibrous vegetables. And as I said, I kept the base solid with the wine. So what happened, this inflamed kind of guy, I was 35 pounds heavier then as well, after 6 to 8 weeks. Well, here's the GGT and the ferritin, and my brother also has high GGT for the same reasons. It's kind of a universal thing. If you do the wrong thing and eat the wrong thing, well, that's what happened to GGT and ferritin. The cholesterol ratios, which are crucial, not so much LDL and cholesterol, but the ratios of the cholesterol measures, were okay, but they got a lot better. And my blood pressure, which was always kind of pre-hypertensive unless I was training for triathlons, came right down along with the weight. Notably, the blood pressure fell in the first week or two because it is not the body weight that drives the hypertension. Most idiopathic hypertension has its basis in hyperinsulinemia related mechanisms and processes. So the blood pressure drops a lot quicker than the weight comes off. So the root cause solution is approved for n equals 1, but all of the science expected this result. So why? Why can I do something like that? Not that I'm great, when the doctors are not even sure at all of what I showed you on these basic blood measures. And one reason is legacy. This guy, Aynsley Cowie, in the 50s and 60s, created a lot of very, very flawed science around cholesterol and fats in the diet. And unfortunately, the world followed him into the void. We're only now seeing it being somewhat recovered, the situation. So we'll move beyond cholesterol into the primary metrics and drivers of heart disease based on my research and my worldwide network of doctors, researchers, and professors of metabolism and many other fields. I gave a talk on YouTube if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the lipoprotein transport process and how and why all of what I'm saying is true, but it's very detailed. It's an hour and 20 minutes long, but interesting to some. I'm going to bring out Thomas Dayspring, one of America's foremost lipidologists, experts in cholesterol. This guy is top of his field, given thousands of lectures to cardiologists and other groups. And he clarified for me a few years ago that yes, Ivor, the majority of heart attacks are due to insulin resistance. Okay, I knew that, but it was good to hear it from a cholesterol guy. And he said LDL is a near worthless predictor for cardiovascular issues unless it's above 5 millimole. And even then there's debates, but interesting. But we didn't have to wait for Tom, because in 1996, William P. Castelli, the director of Framium, a cardiologist and data expert who reviewed all the data of the biggest heart study ever, it's still running, said that unless LDL levels are above 7.8 millimole, and you know how big that is, they have no value in isolation in predicting event rates and risk, right? He also said something crucial. The total over HDL ratio is a better predictor than everything else put together from the cholesterol panel. And he's entirely right, entirely correct, in all the studies. And I have tens, if not hundreds of them. Why? Why are the ratios of the cholesterol measures so predictive and the individual ones are so weak? Well, here's why. Here's the Women's Health Study. You can see LDL is a very weak risk estimator. And as you come down, you see the total over HDL ratio, or the triglyceride over HDL, which is very similar mechanistically, has a vastly better prediction of future events, right? And the reason is because the ratios reflect your level of insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. It's not really a cholesterol thing. Those ratios are directly driven by your insulin and leptin signaling, okay? That's why they're powerful. So I'll show you a couple of studies. This is a great Chinese one. You can see there a low LDL group and a high LDL group, and I think middle-aged people, several thousand. And whether their LDL is low or high, there's no difference in risk. They're flat 1.0. But look at the group where their total over HDL ratio is greater than 5, meaning insulin resistance. They've both got very high risk, high or low LDL. And that's because they're more insulin resistant, as I just explained a moment ago. Let's look at one from 2015. We followed 103,000 men and women middle-aged over 8 years. Excellent study. The LDL low or very high made really no difference in risk. There was a little, statistically significant, but small. But look at the triglyceride over HDL ratio. That was a massive predictor of event rates, because it reflects insulin resistance, which is what's driving the bus. Mostly, it's multifactorial, but mostly. And as myself and Dr. Gerber, who contributed this material, is my co-author from Denver, we call insulin resistance the elephant, and we put LDL in there as well. So, what happens if you measure insulin resistance extremely accurately? And Reven here used a steady state plasma glucose, a several hour insulin clamp test, very accurate. They got a few hundred middle-aged people, followed them for 7 years, and the lowest tertile of that excellent insulin test had no disease, no death, which is unusual for middle-aged people over 7 years. The middle tertile again, had a good bit of action, and the top tertile kind of won out, right? Heart attacks, cancers, diabetes, all the diseases of modernity predicted by an accurate insulin test. The risk multiplier for being high in steady state plasma glucose versus low was 40x for the outcomes. 40x. LDL in this study from the same data was 1.001x, non-significant, obviously. One last glance. Another study, children, teenagers, works there as well. 25-year follow-up of teenagers with insulin resistance syndrome had a 15x risk for future cardiovascular events. So think what you should be measuring in teenagers. Insulin metrics. A friend of ours who died last year, Dr. Joseph Kraft, tested 15,000 people accurately with 5-hour insulin glucose assays, and he came to amazing conclusions. He did state that those with cardiovascular disease not identified with diabetes are simply undiagnosed. Now that's a powerful statement. And I don't think everyone with cardiovascular disease is driven by diabetic dysfunction. But let's look at EuroAspire 2015 and check Joe out. They took around 7,000 coronary artery disease victims, ages 18 to 80, across 24 countries of Europe. That's an engineering poll that represents the whole problem in a huge area of all ages. They found out promptly that around a third of them were full type 2 diabetics documented. So they took those guys out because they knew those guys were going to have massive heart disease, right? They had 4,004 left, non-diabetics, until they measured their glucose. A third of those were full-blown type 2 diabetics, undiagnosed. Another third they called high risk for diabetes, which is diabetes, trust me. And the remaining third were not tested with insulin. And you cannot tell diabetes unless you test with insulin and post-glucose insulin response. So when you put them all back together, including the original documented diabetics, over 3/4 of all the CAD victims in Europe of all ages were essentially diabetic. And the remainder weren't measured with insulin. So I think, Joe, you were pretty close on the money, right? Now, that may be one of the reasons that we can have this in Medscape in February. The burden of CVD is growing faster than our ability to combat it. That's a pretty strong statement. And projections, it could get worse, and I know none of us want that. But 2030 projections from 10 years ago are now being met in 15. Now this is the US in fairness, and the UK probably not nearly as bad. And we have a saying in engineering, if you don't measure it, it don't get fixed. And I think part of this problem is for many decades, we've not really been measuring the measurements that speak to root cause and allow for very effective interventions. So final part, and I'll let you go to dinner. CVD prevention, root cause solution view. And I am going to just do a couple of slides on calcification test because myself and Dr. Gerber think it's amazing. We have studied it a lot and it's incredible. On the left you see no calcium in the coronary arteries. That's Jeff's scan. He's a 0 at 54 years old, which is actually a 15-year warranty for all-cause mortality, they're calling it. On the right we see calcification in the coronary arteries, and that's not just a reflection of plaque burden and atherosclerosis, which it is. It's a reflection of all the root causes that drive inflammatory reactions in the body, and that's why CAC predicts all-cause mortality as powerfully or more than cardiovascular. There is an interview again on YouTube with the top person on the West Coast, Professor Matt Budoff, an expert in imaging. 20 minutes long if you're interested. It was a great interview, I think, if I say so myself. But have a quick look, 2015 imaging journal, Cardiology Imaging. You can see there from a low calcium score to a high, we've got a 30x increase in event rates, approximately. Now that's predictive power, because calcification is looking at the actual disease process and extent itself. It's not a surrogate like cholesterol or BP. And there are thousands of papers, well, thousands of subjects, hundreds of papers, they all say the same thing. And here in all-cause mortality, a very large number of people in this study, and you'll notice that as you go from left to right, they've tracked how many risk factors the people have, from 0 right up to over 3. And sure, having more risk factors predicts higher mortality. But look at CAC, independent of risk factors. It obliterates the risk factor predictive power because it's looking at the disease process, not a surrogate. Okay? One last thing on CAC progression. Great study here. On the left you see highest CAC people of different levels followed for 7 years with serial scanning. Basically, people who had an over 15% increase per year on average, they're the mortality curves, right? The Kaplan-Meiers. It's outrageous. It's absolute carnage. But if you look at the people, the same people in the study who had less than 15% progression per year, believe it or not, and it's not my data, it's a published study, even with a high score at the start, if you stopped your progression, your outcome was pretty much background population level. That's what I call a test. It's an engineering test. So wrapping it up with some solutions, and I can't provide proofs here, but I give you a view, or our view of the world. We're all on a human chronic disease spectrum, and it's best delineated by your level of hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance. That's the very central processor of the human in terms of health. On the bottom left, we've got people who are truly non-diabetic, euinsulinemic, Kraft called them. And these guys have exquisite leptin and insulin signaling. Their adipose tissue is working perfectly, and they have low rates of disease if they don't get eaten by a tiger or whatever. Up on the right, we've got full-blown wheels off the wagon type 2 diabetes, and this is simply, type 2 diabetes is just hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, just got to the end game. And there's very clear processes happen at the end where your liver can't stop making glucose and your adipose tissue can't control the flux. But besides that, that's the end. Bottom left, you've got good health, longevity, vitality, productivity, quality of life. There's a lot to be played for on the spectrum. Top right, MIs, strokes, type 3 diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancers, much higher rates. There's a lot to play for on the spectrum. Bottom left, you've got you insulinemic, healthy, non-diabetic. Whether fat or thin, doesn't matter. Your insulin dynamics are what will tell you. Middle third of the population, we reckon, in American adults are hyperinsulinemic, essentially diabetic, whether fat or thin. Upper end, highly hyperinsulinemic, very unhealthy, very diabetic. And basically you can have thin people, TOFIs, thin outside, fat inside, with their pancreas and their liver full of fat. They're just as high risk as the big guy we all assume is unhealthy. I was flagged by GGT and ferritin as it happened, which started my odyssey. And then David found me. He was flagged with a calcium scan. All his bloods looked perfect. HbA1c was 5.1. Everything lovely. Passed the treadmill test. Top 10% of fitness for his age. Running 4 times a week. Went in and got a calcium scan. 3 blocked arteries. Right? Worst 1% of cardiovascular disease for his age. 75% of people expected to have a major event in the following 10 years. So he's an entrepreneur in Ireland, and he got very angry, and he's hence trying to save other people with awareness. What about you or your patients? Well, we've got the CAC. I touched on how powerful that is. But we've also got blood tests, and I won't go through them all, but postprandial, post-meal glucose and insulin are very powerful, but even the HOMA metric of insulin resistance from fasting insulin and glucose is pretty good. And we've got the ratios we mentioned and some other great markers of inflammation. How do you fix it? Myself and Dr. Gerber, 10 levers. First 3 are eliminations. You eliminate refined carbon sugar. That's responsible and underpins most of our chronic disease in the last 100 years. Eliminate omega-6 vegetable oils. Refined factory-produced vegetable oils are inflammatory, not good for a human. And processed food is stuffed with both. After you've eliminated that, a low-carb, healthy vegetable, above-ground leafy vegetable diet, lots of healthy fats, fish, avocado, and ancestral meats as well, grass-fed, not factory stuff, and moderate high-quality protein. That regime will enable you to control appetite, and I found this stunning when I switched. And that will enable fasting behaviors. And fasting now is hitting the journals. You're going to see a lot more about fasting for cancer, autophagy, longevity. You're probably seeing it already. It's actually all true. And you can do it easily on a healthy low-carb diet. But you can't do it on a high-carb diet. I couldn't do it. Too hungry. Sun, stress, sleep all disrupt the hormonal milieu that I was mentioning, and they are all things you really got to watch. Plenty of healthy sun, low stress, get good sleep. Exercise, resistance training is best, press-ups, lifts, squats. Probably better than running around and around. And supplements, magnesium, potassium, the minerals, particularly important, omega-3, DHA, EPA, all have very mechanistic and proven links into helping this system. So, in closing, you can move yourself down to ancestral health, and if our authorities have been driving these 10 engineering rules for 40 years, I think we'd have a lot more people down here. But they weren't. They were driving some things that were the opposite. And that leads to metabolic mayhem. Cardiovascular disease is a metabolic dysfunction disease, essentially, and where we are today. So I'll finish with the key messages. Thank you.
One question. Sally said one question. It's going to be a good one. No question. Okay. Off we go, Kath.
How low is your carbohydrate diet? How low should, in your view, should we go? How many grams a day?
That's a great question because it's contentious at the moment. We've got the ketogenic people going ultra low, below 20 grams, 30 grams of digestible carbohydrate. I'm happy that most people, a low carbohydrate of 50, 60, 70 grams or around 20% of energy in your diet is a broad, good rule of thumb. The guidelines are 60%, I'd say 20. And given that it's actually published now that over half of adult Americans are pre-diabetic or diabetic, that's published. Now it's actually higher than that, but with their criteria. Anyone who's pre-diabetic or diabetic, which is insulin resistant, they're actually carbohydrate intolerant by definition. So when you keep that in mind, feeding carbohydrate to a fundamentally, technically carbohydrate intolerant person, of which the majority of adult Americans are now, don't make sense.